Hey everyone, welcome back. We're diving into something pretty creepy today, the scariest vampire designs in horror movies.
Oh, yeah. Some really freaky ones out there.
Yeah, so we've got this awesome article from Bloody Disgusting, and they've ranked some truly chilling vampires.
It's a classic monster, but some designs just really get under your skin.
Right, like we all know what a vampire is, but what makes certain designs so unforgettable, so genuinely scary?
That's a great question. I think it has a lot to do with how those designs tap into our fears.
Oh, for sure.
Mhm.
And how those fears change over time, too.
Exactly. Vampires have always been a reflection of our anxieties, and the way they look on screen often mirrors those anxieties.
Okay, so this article highlights 6 particularly scary vampire designs.
Hmm.
And get this, we're talking everything from silent films to modern action flicks. It's a huge range.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Yeah, you really see how the vampire myth has evolved and adapted over the decades.
So get ready for some seriously creepy stuff. We're talking jaw-dislocating super predators, demonic bat-like figures, and even some with a distinctly prehistoric vibe. You know, not your typical charming Dracula.
Sounds awesome. I'm ready to be terrified.
Let's start with a modern example that still gives me chills. The Reapers from Blade 2. These guys were next level. Like, remember how they could dislocate their jaws to bite their victim?
Oh, yeah, that was so creepy. It was more than just a cool visual, too. It showed how they were super predators, even more dangerous than regular vampires.
Totally. And you can see director Guillermo del Toro's fingerprints all over those creatures, that signature blend of grotesque beauty he's known for.
Absolutely. It's like a dark fairy tale aesthetic.
Exactly. And it's interesting, to compare those Reapers to the vampires in his The Strain, both the books and the TV series. He revisited the vampire myth there, drawing inspiration from parasitic creatures.
Oh, yeah. It's like he's fascinated by the idea of vampires as unstoppable forces of nature.
Right, like something ancient and primal that we can't control.
Yeah. That's a really interesting point, especially thinking about when Blade 2 came out the early 2000s. The world felt a little less safe back then.
Yeah, you're right. Maybe those Reapers tapped into a collective anxiety about, I don't know, sudden overwhelming threats.
Makes sense. Horror often reflects the anxieties of its time, even if it's not intentional.
Okay, let's switch gears to another creature that still haunts my dreams. Dwight Renfield, the titular Night Flier from that 1997 Stephen King adaptation. Now, this one might be a bit divisive, but I've always found that demonic bat-like appearance utterly terrifying.
Yeah, that one was pretty wild. It really went for the full-on monster look.
Pure nightmare fuel. It's like something out of a Hieronymus Bosch painting. The oversized head, the leathery wings, those glowing eyes, it's all designed to trigger a primal fear response.
Oh, yeah, it definitely gets under your skin.
Yeah.
And what's so interesting is that even though some aspects of the design, like the billowing cape, could be seen as a bit over the top, it still works. It doesn't tip over into cheesy.
You know what? You're right. It could have been cheesy, but somehow it's not. I think it's because the film commits so fully to that monstrous, exaggerated style. It's like it's tapping into a primal fear of something truly inhuman, something beyond our comprehension.
I think that's it. It pushes the boundaries of what we consider realistic, and that makes it even more unsettling.
For sure. It's like a glimpse into a dark and twisted reality that we'd rather not acknowledge.
Right. And that's what good horror does. It forces us to confront those uncomfortable truths.
Now, for something completely different, let's talk about the shark-toothed vampires from the 1985 classic Fright Night. Now, you wouldn't necessarily expect a horror comedy to have genuinely frightening creatures, but these guys were the real deal. Those incredibly distinctive, almost reptilian faces, those razor-sharp protruding teeth. I mean, yikes.
I know. They're so creepy. What's so clever about that design is how it subverts expectations. You've got this fun comedic tone, and then bam, you're confronted with these genuinely predatory-looking creatures.
It's like the filmmakers were saying, hey, we can have fun, but don't forget that vampires are still monsters.
Exactly. And the makeup supervisor, Steve Johnson, he was a master of his craft. He really wanted to move away from that traditional, more elegant vampire look and make them truly animalistic.
And that was a big shift in special effects at the time. Practical effects were king,
Yeah.
and Johnson was really pushing the boundaries of what was possible with prosthetics and makeup.
Yeah, those effects hold up surprisingly well. You really believe that those creatures are capable of tearing you apart.
Right. There's a weight and a physicality to them that you don't always get with CGI.
It's interesting to compare them to the vampires in the 2011 Fright Night remake, which went for a much more sleek and modern aesthetic. What do you think of that choice?
It's interesting. I think that the remake's vampires were trying to tap into a different kind of fear, something more seductive and alluring.
Yeah, like a more modern take on the vampire myth.
Exactly. But for sheer visceral terror, the original shark tooth design wins hands down. Those things were nightmare fuel.
I completely agree. They captured that blend of the familiar and the monstrous so well.
Okay, let's fast forward to a more recent example.
Yeah.
Javier Botet's portrayal of Dracula in The Last Voyage of the Demeter. This movie tackles the infamous Captain's Log section from Bram Stoker's novel, and it gives us a truly monstrous vision of Dracula. I mean, this is not your typical suave and charming count.
Oh, yeah. Botet is a master of playing these unsettling creatures. His Dracula is so unique, it's almost demonic, like a wereback creature. They really leaned into the animalistic, predatory side of the character.
Yeah, it's like a primal force of nature, unstoppable and terrifying.
And it's interesting how they chose to adapt that specific part of the novel. The Captain's Log is essentially a series of increasingly horrifying journal entries. They chronicle Dracula's reign of terror aboard the ship.
It's one of the scariest parts of the book because it builds this slow burn sense of dread, and the film really captures that. It's like, a haunted house story, but on the high seas.
Exactly. And with this terrifying inhuman creature stalking the crew, it's claustrophobic and intense.
And Botet's performance, even under all that makeup, is incredible. He brings a real sense of physicality and menace to the role.
Yeah, there's a strange kind of dark humor to it, too, almost like he's relishing the terror he's inflicting.
Right. It's like he's playing with his food.
Yeah, and that adds another layer to the horror. It's not just that he's a monster, but he seems to enjoy being one, and that's truly unsettling.
Now let's travel back in time to the granddaddy of vampire cinema, the original Nosferatu from 1922. Even though the design might seem a bit dated to modern audiences, there's no denying the chilling effect it had on viewers back then.
Oh yeah, Nosferatu is a classic for a reason. It's pure atmospheric horror.
Totally. Those elongated fingers, the piercing eyes, that unsettling inhuman demeanor, it all added up to a genuinely terrifying portrayal of a creature of the night.
And it's important to remember the context in which it was made. This was post-World War I Germany, a time of immense social and political upheaval. People were grappling with trauma loss and a sense of uncertainty about the future.
Right, so that design isn't just about being scary, it's tapping into something deeper. A fear of the unknown, of forces beyond our control. Plus all those rumors that actor Max Schreck might have actually been a real vampire, just added to the film's mystique and made it all the more unsettling.
Oh yeah, those rumors were wild. Whether they were true or not, they fed into the public's imagination. It's a perfect example of how the context surrounding a film can influence its impact.
Totally agree. Sometimes the stories behind the movie are just as scary as the movie itself.
For sure. It adds a whole other layer of creepiness.
Speaking as context for our final scary vampire design, let's look at Marlow's Tribe from 30 Days of Night. This 2007 film took the idea of a vampire horde to a whole new level of terrifying. I mean, these weren't your typical elegant bloodsuckers. These were like predatory animals.
Oh yeah. Marlow's Tribe is a fantastic example of how a more primal animalistic design can be incredibly effective. They were like prehistoric predators, these relentless, almost feral creatures, and their design with those sharp teeth, glowing eyes, and pale, almost translucent skin, it all emphasized their otherworldly nature.
Yeah, they were like a force of nature. You couldn't reason with them. You couldn't escape them. They were just pure instinct, pure hunger.
And the setting, that isolated Alaskan town, added to that feeling of helplessness. Like there was nowhere to run, nowhere to hide.
It's interesting to think about how this design might reflect our evolving fears in the new millennium. We were just a few years removed from 9/11, and there was this growing sense of vulnerability, of unseen forces that could disrupt our lives in a heartbeat.
That's a really insightful connection. These vampires weren't just elegant or seductive. They were brutal and efficient, like a force of nature you couldn't reason with. And the fact that they descended upon this isolated town, cutting it off from the outside world, added to that feeling of helplessness. It's almost like a zombie apocalypse film, but with vampires.
Right. It's like the ultimate nightmare scenario, being trapped with these relentless predators with no way to fight back.
Exactly. And the visual style of the film, that starkness, those quick cuts, it all amplified the sense of chaos and terror.
Oh yeah, the way those vampires move so fast, so fluid, it was terrifying.
It's funny you mention that because the film was actually based on a comic book miniseries of the same name. And the artist Ben Templesmith, he has this really unique style. Very dark, very stylized.
It's funny you mentioned the comic book inspiration because both vampire and zombie stories often reflect our anxieties about societal collapse, about losing control. And that visual style, those jagged lines and stark contrasts, really amplified the sense of dread in both the comic and the film.
You're absolutely right. The visual style plays a huge role in shaping our emotional response to a film. It sets the tone, creates the atmosphere.
So we've covered incredible vampire designs so far, each tapping into different fears and anxieties.
Mm.
I'm curious what stood out to you about these designs. What makes them genuinely scary beyond just their physical appearance? It's the way they make you feel so vulnerable.
Yeah.
Like you're looking at these creatures and, there's just no reasoning with them.
Right, like no appealing to their humanity or anything.
Exactly. They're just pure instinct,
Yeah.
driven by this hunger that can't be satisfied.
I think you've hit on something really important there. It's that lack of empathy, that sense of otherness. That's what makes vampires so unsettling.
And filmmakers use all sorts of techniques to amplify that feeling. Like the way vampires move.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
They're often depicted as being so fast, so fluid, it's like they're defying gravity.
Right. It makes them seem even more powerful, more unpredictable.
Totally. And it makes us feel so small and helpless in comparison.
Absolutely. Movement is so crucial in horror. Think about the way the Reapers in Blade 2 moved almost like insects, or those quick, jerky movements of the vampires in 30 Days of Night.
It's so unsettling, makes them feel less human, more predatory.
Exactly. Like they're not bound by the same rules that we are.
And it's not just the visuals either. Sound design plays a huge role in building that atmosphere of terror.
Oh, absolutely. Sound can be so effective at getting under your skin.
A well-placed hiss, a guttural growl, the sound of heavy breathing. Those sounds just tap into our primal instincts. It makes us feel like we're being stalked, even when we can't see the threat.
You're so right. Sound can often be even more effective than visuals at creating a sense of unease.
Like, even if you don't see the vampire, it's out there, somewhere lurking in the shadows.
Think about the original Nosferatu. There's very little dialogue in that film. It relies heavily on sound effects and music to build tension.
Yeah, and the silence itself becomes a source of dread.
Exactly.
Well-
It's like you're waiting for the other shoe to drop. Your senses are on high alert.
Yeah.
And when the vampire finally does appear, the impact is that much more powerful.
Speaking of Nosferatu, I think it's a great example of how minimalist design can be incredibly effective. Count Orlok's appearance is relatively simple compared to some of the more elaborate designs we see in modern films.
Right. But there's something about that simplicity, that starkness, that makes him so unsettling.
He looks almost skeletal, like a walking corpse, and those elongated fingers, the way he moves almost like a puppet. It's so unnatural, so disturbing.
You can see how that image would have terrified audiences back in 1922. It was unlike anything they'd ever seen before.
And those long, sharp teeth like needles, it's a primal fear,
Yeah.
of being pierced, of being drained.
Absolutely. It tapped into a fear of death, of decay. And that fear is universal regardless of the time period.
It's amazing how these designs can transcend cultural and historical boundaries. We might laugh at the special effects in some of the older vampire films, but the core fears they tap into those remain the same.
Yeah, we're still fascinated and terrified by these creatures. They exist on the edge of humanity.
Yeah.
They represent our darkest impulses.
Exactly. And that's why vampires continue to resonate with us. They offer this safe space to explore our anxieties about mortality, about the darkness that exists within ourselves.
It's like we can project our fears onto these creatures, confront them in a fictional setting, and hopefully emerge from the experience a little less afraid.
That makes sense. It's cathartic in a way of processing our anxieties through storytelling.
And the designs themselves play a huge role in shaping that experience. A truly effective vampire design. It'll stay with you long after the credits roll, haunting your dreams, making you look over your shoulder in the dark.
Speaking of haunting designs, I want to circle back to something you mentioned earlier about how vampire designs often reflect the anxieties of their time. It's fascinating to trace that evolution and see how those fears have manifested visually.
It's a really interesting way to look at it, like a cultural history of fear.
For example, in the early days of vampire cinema, vampires were often depicted as these otherworldly, almost demonic beings. They were symbols of the unknown, of forces beyond our understanding.
And those films were often steeped in religious imagery playing on fears of damnation and the supernatural.
Oh, for sure. Think about the classic image of Dracula rising from his coffin. It's almost like a scene from a medieval painting of hell.
Exactly. And that religious subtext was particularly potent in a time when people's faith was being challenged by, scientific advancements and social change.
Yeah, vampires became this way of expressing anxieties about the loss of traditional values.
Right. And then as we move into the 20th century, you start to see a shift in vampire designs. They become more sophisticated, more human-like. Think about Bela Lugosi's iconic portrayal of Dracula.
Oh yeah, he was suave, charming, and irresistible. But there was also this darkness lurking beneath the surface.
He was the ultimate seducer, and that reflected this growing anxiety about sexuality and the changing roles of men and women in society.
It's no coincidence that vampire stories often feature female victims being lured into a life of darkness.
It's a recurring theme for sure. It speaks to this deep-seated fear of female agency, of women breaking free from societal expectations.
And then in more recent decades, we see a resurgence of those more monstrous, animalistic vampire designs, like we talked about earlier, the Reapers in Blade 2 and Marlow's tribe in 30 Days a Night.
It's like they've been stripped of any humanity, any sense of remorse. They're just pure killing machines.
And that shift coincides with a growing societal anxiety about violence and chaos in the modern world.
Right. We're bombarded with images of war, terrorism, natural disasters. It's no wonder that our monsters reflect that heightened sense of vulnerability.
It's like these more monstrous vampires are an embodiment of that fear, of the feeling that the world is a dangerous and unpredictable place.
I think you're right. And the way filmmakers use these designs to create a sense of relentless pursuit, of overwhelming force, it really taps into those primal fears.
It's interesting to think about how these designs might continue to evolve as our fears change and adapt. What do you think the next generation of scary vampire designs will look like?
That's a great question. I think we'll see a continued exploration of that animalistic, predatory side of vampires. But I also think there's potential for new and unexpected interpretations. Perhaps we'll see vampires that reflect our anxieties about technology, about artificial intelligence, or even about climate change. Who knows?
It's exciting to think about the possibilities. And it's a reminder that horror, at its best, isn't just about cheap scares. It's a reflection of our deepest fears and anxieties.
Absolutely. And it can offer a fascinating window into the human psyche.
We've talked a lot about how these designs reflect our collective fears, but I'm curious to hear from our listener. What about you? What do you think makes a vampire design truly scary? Is it the physical features, the way they move, or is it something else entirely?
Yeah, like what is it about a certain design that just gets under your skin?
Maybe it's a specific vampire that's always creeped you out. Or, like a design element that you just find super disturbing.
Like those crazy long fingers in Nosferatu.
Exactly. Share your thoughts. We'd love to hear what scares you about these creatures of the night.
And, as you revisit these films and encounter these iconic vampires, think about what their designs might reveal about the fears and anxieties of the time they were created.
Yeah, it's a fascinating way to look at horror. Like, it's not just entertainment. It's a reflection of our culture, our history.
It's a window into the human psyche.
So there you have it, our deep dive into the scariest vampire designs in horror movies. We've journeyed from the silent era to modern blockbusters, dissecting jaw-dropping transformations and monstrous visages.
And we've seen how these designs have evolved, reflecting our changing fears and anxieties.
Yeah, it's amazing how something as simple as a monster's appearance can tell us so much about ourselves.
Exactly. And it reminds us that horror at its best isn't just about jump scares. It's a reflection of ourselves, a way of confronting the darkness that exists both within us and in the world around us.
I hope this deep dive has given you a newfound appreciation for the art of monster design.
And maybe even inspired you to revisit some of these classic films.
Yeah, go back and watch them. But this time, pay close attention to those designs.
You might be surprised at what you discover.
So until next time, keep exploring the dark corners of horror. And never be afraid to face your fears.
And if you stumble upon a vampire design that truly chills you to the bone, be sure to share it with us.
We're always hungry for more horror. Thanks for listening.